Hi everyone, this is John from Sharp Mountain Games, and I'm here today to do a role-playing game book review for you. And we're going to take a look at Starships and Spacemen 2nd Edition. Carry out missions in the final frontier, and you can see the very beautiful digital art cover. And it's by Dan Proctor at Goblinoid Games. And the interior artwork was done by Mark Allen and Steve Zeiser, and we're going to look at the book on the interior in just a few minutes, so you'll be able to see that artwork. Now, what is this book? What it is an OSR, or old school version, of Star Trek. It's not an officially licensed product. It was put out in 1978, the first version, and I think another company had the license to Star Trek at that point. So they kind of filed off the serial numbers, changed a few names, but for all intents and purposes, this is old school Star Trek. And the first version was put out in 1978 by Leonard Canterman, and it ran about 80 or 90 pages. And this is an updated version, and it was put out by Dan Proctor of Goblinoid Games. Now, this is the same person who's also written some books, Mutant Future, Labyrinth Lord, and Apes Victorious. And I might review Apes Victorious in a later video. So the idea behind this book is that he took the original Starships and Spacemen, he bought the license to it, Dan Proctor did, and updated it. And did some rewriting. It's not just in editing. He added a lot of things apparently, and tried to make it compatible with the other products that Goblinoid Games puts out, like Mutant Future, Apes Victorious, Labyrinth Lord. And also, most of the stuff in here with very little conversion could be used with any other OSR rule set. So if you're playing original AD&D, first edition, if you're playing the BX version of D&D, or my personal favorite, the basic fantasy version of old school Dungeons & Dragons or old school fantasy, you can use a lot of the things in this book with just a little bit of adapting. It's not that hard. So let me take a moment, move the camera, and we'll take a look inside the book. Okay, so here's the book, and as you can see, it has a beautifully digitally painted cover. I believe that's by Mark Allen. And let's take a look. Now you can see from page 1, it screams Star Trek. Again, it's an unlicensed product. However, there isn't an old school Star Trek product available. But you can clearly see, looking at the uniforms, I mean, they look like from the movie era of Star Trek. And we'll do a flip through here. I won't hit every single page, but we'll try to. So you can see these guys are fighting what they call the Zagnids, but they're really Klingons, and they even have that Klingon dog there. So brief introduction, and then we get right into creating characters. And it has an ability chart modifier, which is very, very reminiscent of all other old school games. And then after you allocate your ability scores, and it suggests rolling for them, but of course you could use another method if you wanted to have, I like a standard score package, or you could certainly do like 4d6, drop the lowest, or allow players to put their ability scores however they want. And then it gets into the races. And again, these are very, very reminiscent of Star Trek. You have your Vulcans, you have Lieutenant Arix, I believe, from the animated series, who was an Edoan, I think. You have a Gorn, and you have a few other races right there. And that doesn't take very long. Like you can see, the races are 3.5 maybe pages. And then it gets right into classes. Now, besides the ability scores, there are 4 skills, and only 4. There's combat, there's science, there's technical, and there's contact, which is kind of a personality score. And you can be in the military branch, and then there's some subclasses. Where did you go into command, or did you go into security or fire control? And they might give you a secondary skill. And then same thing in science. Did you go into medicine? Did you go into biology? Sentient life, I think, is more like maybe alien species or space in general. And then there's a technical branch also, which is basically Scotty, Uhura. Are you the communications officer? Are you the engineer? Are you the navigator? Now, one of the things, and it might be hard to see here on the advancement chart, is that as you advance, you get promoted. And that's a little bit quirky, and I saw a reviewer online who mentioned, when you're 12th level, you're an admiral-in-chief. Well, if you're all 12th level, are you all going to be admirals-in-chief and, still adventuring on a planet? But you could always hack that and make you could still have them advance, but maybe just have them get promoted a little less often. And then there's the idea of enlisted crew. So these are kind of your space marines. people who didn't go through officer training. And you don't have to be that. You know, I think if you look at the original Star Trek, most of them were officers, but you have that option too. Now, here's the core of the skills, and it's this skill chart right up here. So if you go into science, your primary skill is science. But if you got a subclass, maybe you'll have a secondary skill in technical. So somebody like Spock, his primary skill would be science, but his secondary would be technical. And then there's a column for other. So anything you don't have a skill on, you just roll on that chart. All of the rolling is roll under. So, for example, if it's something general like lifting something, you might just roll under your strength value. And then here, these numbers progress. So in your primary skill, you start out at 12. You also get a little bump. For example, if your primary skill is science and you have a high intelligence, you might get a +1 or +2. So you'd roll under 12 or 13 or 14. And then as you get higher and higher in level, that number goes up. So it's a way to increase your skills without having to add a lot of higher and higher modifiers. So it is a roll under system. Just keep that in mind. Now, that being said, if you're from a later edition and you prefer roll over, you can switch this no problem. So if you have a 12 in something, make that a +2. If you have a 15 in something, make that a +5, and you can easily swap this if you want to make it more consistent with some later edition games. And then we get into some other minor things like age, equipment. Now, it does have you buy the equipment. So if you're playing something like a Traveler kind of game, you might want to do that, or if you remember the old Star Frontiers. However, I think for Star Trek, I wouldn't worry about that. I wouldn't, just whatever equipment they need, Starfleet's going to give them. There's even a robotic dog. Kind of looks like K9 there. An armored tank if you need that. Now it gets into psionic powers, and there are a few, although only a few races can have them. Humans actually can roll, I believe there's a 5% chance that they can be psionic. So you can do that at character creation if you like. And they kind of function like D&D spells. There's not a whole lot of them. It does try to keep it trimmed down. And in fact, even if you wanted to try to adapt this maybe for Star Wars, you might want to add just a few powers. I don't think it would be that hard. For example, there's nothing which sort of lets you see the future the way they would in Star Wars. But I think you could make that adjustment, even though the game is primarily written for Star Trek. Then there's some information on this. Again, a lot of the stuff that follows is more for the Dungeon Master or the Star Master, as they call it. And this is basically Planetary Adventures. This is the rules chapter. Tells you how to do combat, tells you how to do healing. What if you get poisoned? What if you get stunned? And there are saving throws in here, and they are very reminiscent of the old school saving throws. But instead of, like Dragon Breath, there's some adjustments for that. And I don't see the chart real handy, but it's in here. Then it gets into some galactic adventures, talking more about dangers you might see in space. You can see there's some more artwork. All the artwork in here is old school black and white artwork. It definitely has that old school kind of self-published vibe, but it has its own charm in that way. And it gives you some ideas about, this is again more the scientific. How would you set up a star system? How would you have random encounters in space or a random star system? What if you get a disease? And you can see this guy here looks like he's getting really old. Like there was the one episode of the original Star Trek where they had an aging disease. Star bases. I think you see that kind of really looks like an old school star base you'd see on the old Star Trek. Then it gets into starships. And of course they have the teleporter or the transporter. They give you some statistics for not a whole lot, maybe about 10 starships here. Talks about enemy ships, and they have their version of the Klingons and the Romulans. Now, the starship combat system here is fairly simple. It's really much more geared for storytelling. For example, there's a chart here very similar to the skill progression chart, and there's a ship skill. And it depends on how far away you are. So if you're within a certain range, that's going to depend. The further away you are, the harder it is to hit your enemy. Now, the ship skill doesn't improve. However, if you're like a tactical officer, you do get a little bit of a bonus to hitting the enemies. And talks about how to evade. And then this is a nice chapter because this is basically the monster manual, the alien counters. And it lists a whole lot of different aliens, like look at that one right there, the scaled cones, that you could easily port over to your Dungeons and Dragons game or fantasy game or some other science fiction game. Now, one thing that's a little quirky in the system is that armor is negative. Armor class is always negative. So, for example, this beastie, his armor is -4. So if you needed a 12 or under to hit, well, he's at armor -4. 12 minus 4 is 8. You'd need an 8 to hit. Now, there's a little workaround that works, especially at your lower levels. When you get into really high levels, this might be a problem. But for most of your levels, this works. I didn't use this. I actually ran a Starships and Spacemen game at a convention game a few years ago. So what I did was, the player, I just tell them, look, roll under your skill, but not too low. So for example, let's say they had a 12. They have to roll under a 12, but because this armor class is -4, I just made it 4. A 1, 2, 3, or 4 is a failure. That way the player doesn't have to subtract anything, and everything's on me as the Star Master or the Game Master. And it's actually really not a problem, because most of the time they're either going to fail when they do their roll, or they're going to succeed and the number will be high enough. I only really need to check the armor class at all if they're rolling especially low, like 1 to 5 or underneath that. And also, a really easy port here is, like I said, let's go back to that armor class of -4. If you want to use ascending armor class, go right ahead. Just take that -4, make it positive. Okay, 10 plus 4, that's armor class 14. Something that is armor class -2, that's armor class 12. So if you prefer a roll over system, you're set. There's a cyborg, sort of like the Borg. Here's the Klingon dogs. And there's a whole bunch more I'm not going to be able to go over. There's an ice monster. And they have a separate, here's their version of the Tribbles. They're really cute, and if you pet them, they will reproduce. So they're kind of like the Tribbles or the Gremlins, and you could easily bring those to your game. Space Slug. And there's a separate section for the humanoids. So like your frog people, your Gorn-type people, primitive men. I like this illustration. I think that one they did really nice. I actually that one I could see in an actual old school printed game like Star Frontiers or something. Klingons and Romulans. And this is cool. They give you not 1, not 10, but 100 different foreheads. So if you want to play a next generation type game where they all had those wacky foreheads, you can actually roll on this chart and get the different foreheads to make them forehead aliens. The way Worf had his Klingon brow, and there were a whole bunch of other ones that did too. So that's kind of a fun little thing. And then talks a little bit more about aliens and some random encounters. Alien artifacts. So you have like a mind switching booth. And a lot of these, there's time travel things. So a lot of these, they're sort of like the treasure sections in a Dungeons and Dragons type book. But they certainly mirror things that we saw in the old Star Trek episodes. And then there's some stuff for the Star Master. Now, this is very general. It's not, doesn't give you a ton of adventure ideas, although it does give you some thoughts, like do you want a diplomatic mission or a distress call or escort duty. Gives you a little sample sector here. But, there's so many plot generators online that you could definitely use that. And it gives you a map and 1 sample adventure. In fact, I made 4 third-level characters. I tried to have like a captain, a science officer, medical, and security. And we ran through this, and nobody died. They were able to make it through there. And I think it ran very fast. You'd be surprised how fast it runs with a roll-under system. I know roll-over is more popular these days. And then gets into the supporters, because I believe this was crowdfunded. And you get a nice character sheet that you certainly could photocopy. And this is basically the ship counter sheet. And that's the book. And there's the back cover if you want to see it. They have some advertisements for their other games. And that's our flip through. So let's have some final thoughts. And talk about who should buy the book, maybe who the book would not appeal to. Let's talk about the ones that it might not appeal to first. If you want a very detailed, rules-heavy system, for making your characters, I don't know that this is going to appeal to you, because not every possible action is covered, and certainly it's a small skill list. If you want a 20 skill list like in some other games, this may not be for you. Now, that said, please consider that you may not need as many skills as you think. For example, in the old series, Spock could play the Vulcan harp and Uhura could sing very beautifully. Well, maybe you don't need an entertaining skill. Maybe you could just have the player say, if there's something about the personal quality they want to put on their character sheet, they could do that. And then they could maybe use their contact skill in that way. Oh, I want to sing to try and charm this animal, or I want to play the harp to appeal to this society that really values music. So the thing is, with just a few little personal qualities, you may not need as many skills as you think. But again, if you're somebody who prefers a lot of skills and a lot of mechanical things for character development, this is a much more streamlined system. Also, if you're expecting a lot of digitally painted art, again, the cover is very nice, but the artwork in here is all old school, black and white for reproduction. It's just not this, you're not getting digitally painted, oil paint type looks like you get in a modern RPG book. So just know that going in. Also, the Starship combat, there's some bookkeeping to keep track of when you're playing it, but it's not a full board game. In fact, they even recommend in there, I guess they have a companion product called Star Explorer, which is more of a board game for the Starship combat. You don't have to buy that. But if you're looking for something that's really, really tactical in terms of the Starship combat, that's not in there. And they even say in the book you may want to port in a system from another one if you prefer. So who should buy it? If you like old school OSR games, you're going to like this book. The artwork is OSR. The tone is OSR. It's very compatible, like I said, with just some minor tweaks. You could easily make it compatible, even if you're using descending armor class. If it's -2, we'll subtract that from 9. And now that's 7 for the armor class. If it's using ascending, add it. 10 plus 2 is 12, and you're good to go. So it's extremely, extremely compatible with a lot of old school systems. And there's some ideas you could easily mine in here for fantasy games. Very fast character generation, if you like that. I mean, you can generate a character in a few minutes. And in fact, even if you don't read through all those classes, just say, okay, my character's good in science, and secondary thing, they're good in combat, and then everything else is beyond that. Put some numbers in, some ability scores, and you're ready to go. It's really, really quick for character generation. And it's easily hackable. You could easily bring in rules from other old school games or newer games. Like they recommend if something's really difficult, give a -4 penalty. Don't worry about that. Say you're going to roll 2 dice and you're going to roll with disadvantage. You're going to take the lower dice. Oh, this is really easy. Go ahead, roll 2 d20s and take the better value for you. So it's really, really hackable. So there are some other systems out there for old school Star Trek. I think there's one called 5-Year Mission, which works with White Star. And I'm sure there's a few others that would certainly work too. But if you're interested, I got the paperback for about $20. Give Starships and Spacemen a look. I really like it. I enjoy it. I'm not looking to get rid of the book. I would absolutely consider running it for a group sometime in the future. So if you like the video, hit the like and subscribe, all that. I'll have a link to where you can find Starships and Spacemen. I'll put that in the comments below. And I'll also put a link for where you can find products from Sharp Mountain Games at the different online platforms like Amazon.com, Roll20, Lulu, and Drive-Thru RPG. So thanks very much for watching, and have a good day.